Hello, everybody. I'm Erica Lukes here with my colleague and my research partner, Jack Brewer. We are with Expanding Frontiers Research, and I want to welcome all of you tonight. It is always really a lot of fun to look in the chat room and see Lord Ludacris and Jim and know that there are so many people that are listening that aren't in chat. I thank you very much for supporting our show. You can go to expandingfrontiersofresearch.org to check everything out, to check out our latest blog, which we'll be discussing tonight. This should be a great night. And I want to just warn you, and hey, Steve, good to see you. I want to just warn you guys on the front end that we are having some technical difficulties. I've spoken with several other people today that seem to be having internet issues. That seems to be the way it's rolling these days. So we know that you roll with us, whatever happens. And I want to thank you again for being loyal supporters and for being people that are interested in having a respectful dialogue about things as we learn things, make more discoveries. And sometimes the way this rolls with the UFO subject specifically, we are told certain things. Sometimes we believe certain things. And then as we educate ourselves, we actually learn more. And some of the myths that have been put out there become just that, myths. And so we're going to talk about that tonight. I want to thank Jack Brewer for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Erica. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for joining us too. Steve Long, Jim, Luda, Go Vols. Going to be a good show tonight and a good weekend. Hi, Amy. I see Amy just checked in. We're going to be talking about the kinds of things that we have in our recent blog post and accompanying video narrated by Erica about research into the 1950s CIA and psychological warfare efforts and how that played out and may have affected the UFO community to some extent. And well, it certainly did. The question is to what extent. And a couple of things I just kind of wanted to say as we get started is I really want to encourage comments and questions from chat. I want to encourage Erica to express her views and any insights she might have as we proceed. I think it's really important, and I try as a researcher to separate my opinion from what can be shown to be established fact. And see, we can take records and we can see what they say, and that's a fact, what's in that record. What it indicates and what it implies may be open to debate and open to discussion. Hi, Sharon. Nice to see you joining us. Glad you're here. And it's important that we watch that in other researchers. Are they presenting their thoughts and their opinions as fact, or are they actually establishing what the fact is and then commenting on what they think it indicates? And I think that's important to bring up to start, Erica, because something we do at Expanding Frontiers, and I feel like some researchers like James Carrion influenced me a lot in this way. We look at what the story tells us from established records, from FOIA requests, from documents that are in public archives, from archive collections that are at college libraries and philosophical societies, and piece together a forensic historic account of what some people were doing and how the circumstances were playing out. And it often, the more complex a situation gets, and if the UFO phenomenon is nothing, it's complex, the more we're going to need to pull from different sources and put these together, cross-reference from this archive and this FOIA request and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to comment some, and thanks for putting up with me doing so, about you often get a really different story from archived records and FOIA releases than you get from hearsay and these endless accounts of UFO sightings and witness narratives and things like that.
You ain't kidding about that one. Yeah. And even right now is it's one of those times where everything is just, we've got a lot of interesting dynamics going on globally in the United States. And you see a lot of interesting dynamics on social media specifically. It's kind of a nightmare, but a lot of people expressing thoughts, we don't even know if they're people, but a lot of influence campaigns taking place, and which is something that's more out in your face. Whereas you talk about some of the things that were going on with NICAP and some of the players involved, and you've been religious about that for many years. Getting the records together, talking about things, laying the evidence out. And, just like all of us that are here, your thoughts and ideas about this subject have changed with the knowledge that you attain. So.
Yes, it certainly does. And we needed to be mindful of that as we give our opinions now, that they're subject to change and are subject to change with future records that we get. We're going to talk about some people tonight, like a man named Nicholas de Rochefort, that I continue to await some 200 pages of records that from the FBI that the National Archives is in custody of, that they have been processing for years now for me, and I continue to await that. So all of these things are subject to future releases and future evidence. And that's why we keep revisiting it too. I wrote blog posts on it, and then I wrote a book about it. And now we're revisiting it all again because it continues to accumulate. We continue to get a little different perspective, a little more information about this guy, a little more information about maybe something his wife was doing that we're like, what's that all about? And it just continues to grow. By the way, go ahead.
I was just to say, or some of the shadowy organizations that have been involved. I mean, it's like a lot of those fly under the radar, as you know. That's the idea. That's what they're trying to do. But the more that we learn and the more that we understand the way this is happening, and again, right now what we're seeing is things are coming to light currently that are exposing some of these structures and the means to which money can be moved from the intelligence community to this organization and so on and so forth. And so it really is, it's a fascinating thing. And go ahead. I'm sorry, I just completely cut you off, but.
I encourage that. Just jump in anytime. Absolutely. One of the things I did notice and that kept me interested in the mid-20th century intelligence community is there are a lot of parallels to today, especially if we look at To the Stars Academy and the intelligence officers and intelligence officials that got involved with them, and that we're to believe are just moonlighting as ufologists, and that in no official capacity, just all these intelligence officials decide that they need to start sending op-eds to newspapers and things about UFOs. So there were a lot of parallels. I'd also like to say, while I'm thinking about it, please, that I have a standing offer for people. I've published 2 books, self-published. The Grays Have Been Framed, which explores exploitation in the UFO community. It explores some of the intelligence community's interest in interrogation techniques and manipulation through hypnosis in the late 1940s and 1950s and the era we're talking about tonight. And then it kind of follows that into how that went into the satanic panic in the late 20th century. And then UFO researchers continue to this day to refuse to acknowledge the problematic aspects of using hypnosis as a memory retrieval tool. And I went into a lot of that in The Graves Have Been Framed. And then a second book I did was called Wayward Sons, NICAP and the IC. And it covers a lot of what we're talking about tonight and provides links and references. And I bring this up in order to say I have a standing offer that if anyone would like one of those books, but now is not a good time for you to make the purchase, just get with me and I'll make sure that you get a free PDF so that you can have it. It's a searchable PDF. You can use it as a research reference and things like that. Search for certain terms and everything. And really would appreciate if you do that, if you would post a review if you find the book helpful. But I have that standing offer that if it's not a good time for you to purchase my books, but you would like to read one, then just get with me and I'll make sure you get a free PDF.
That's great. And I want to just go back to, and both books are excellent. I'm obviously, a big fan of yours, but I want to go back to the Stars Academy because you mentioned that parallel. And to me, what I'm seeing with some of the players into the Stars Academy is, did they actually hold the jobs that they've claimed that they hold? I question every day, well, not every day, but when I'm thinking about it, I question what Kit Green's job really was in the intelligence community. Was he, all of these people have put out things that obviously you can find on the CIA reading room, or you can find different documents. When you look at those documents, those are articles, as you and I have discussed, that have been generated by them and placed into newspapers. Or, it's just, some of these people are highly suspect. So, back in the NICAP days, I've got to ask you, how many of these people do you think were grifters, and how many of these people were used by other intelligence agencies? How many of these people were in our intelligence agency? And how do you think that parallels today?
I think in a lot of ways. I think those are really good points to bring up, Erica. It was a big item among the UFO subculture about whether Luis Elizondo, claiming to have ran an official Pentagon program, and it states on video that it had a $22 million that was put into it. And that was challenged, and no significant evidence for his involvement, much less running it, was ever really put forward, to the point now that some of his biggest allies are saying, nah, that was just wrong. That didn't happen. And that's a really good point. A number of current people that have made, and by current I mean in the past 5 to 7 years, that have made the speaker circuit, the podcast circuit, videos as current or former CIA personnel. I've tried to get that substantiated from them or the CIA and have been unsuccessful with that. I have some requests that are still pending that we'll see, if anything ever comes of that. And we're going to talk about some of that tonight, too, about people that almost certainly were involved with the CIA and why it is that that we can't get confirmation of that, through court proceedings. But yes, there certainly were grifters. I think many people know of a Dr. Frank Stranges during the mid 20th century NICAP era, and he's typically remembered fondly. He was the guy that wrote and promoted Stranger in the Pentagon, I think it was, about Valiant Thor, that was supposed to be a man from Venus that was working at the Pentagon. Very, reminiscent to Skinwalkers in the Pentagon, the name of the book, and these supposed, intelligence officials and all. But Strange is specifically implied, if not directly stated, he was an FBI agent and that he was a significant figure in NICAP. And Kehoe, Donald Kehoe, who actually ran NICAP, published a statement that he'd never even met him. And I managed to get FBI records where then Director Hoover told the Los Angeles FBI office to admonish him strongly about these statements. And I would think when the 1950s LA FBI admonished you strongly, you knew you'd been admonished, But yeah, I mean, he saw it as advantageous as a speaker, as an author, to claim these things. And I mean, that is something that continues. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, and I think it's, yeah. I mean, I think the majority of the people in the topic, unfortunately, who have had a public forum have been grifters. And, and they're also, I believe, as we learn more about Russian propaganda and the way that that is influencing foreign campaigns or foreign, internet or the newspaper back in the day or things. I mean, these are stories, that have roots in disinformation campaigns. And so, where does that begin? Where does that end? I just think it's a very fascinating subject. And that's one of the reasons that I stay interested in this subject, because I definitely don't feel that there is something, ET is not here. Nobody's proven that. So, the games continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And what people are doing becomes quite intriguing. And what we're going to do tonight is somewhat of a brief review of some of the main points of our recent blog post and video, and then look at some of the finer points of it as well, and take viewers on somewhat of a FOIA and archive journey through different documents doing that. And the 1940s, the late 1940s, the United States and the world was coming out of World War II. And there was a lot going on with economic growth and economic plans. And there was something called the Marshall Plan that was a big item of contention among political leaders and different factions of politics. And it was about rebuilding Europe, rebuilding the world. It began to get modified and put in different contexts to be used in South America and Central America and other parts of the world. And I'm sure historians could tell us much more about it than I am able through my amateur research. But from the best I can tell, this offers a lot of opportunity for intelligence agencies. Groups that go to war zones, that go to disaster zones, are bringing aid. They have the advantage of being looked at as rescuers and heroes, and it gives a lot of good publicity. And it also offers an opportunity to be putting personnel in different roles and setting up offices all over the world in some of the most sensitive places. And in 1947, there was a public relations firm that incorporated and began, and it was called Counsel Services. And this was a time when all of these financial things were going on, concerns about the American economy, concerns about the global economy. And Counsel Services Incorporated, and I am going to share the screen here and show some documents about a newspaper clipping that Counsel Services put in. There we go. This was in the 1947 Evening Sun in Baltimore, Maryland. And we can see a woman named Mary Von King, a man named Leo McCormick, and an L.G. Shreve announced the opening of Counsel Services Incorporated, a public relations firm on Monument Street in Saratoga, which was a section of Baltimore. And here we find that there were some newspaper clippings from 1949 and 1950 in which we can see the type of work that Counsel Services was doing. And the reason I became interested in Counsel Services and tracing their history, as we will explore as we continue, they incorporated NICAP with Townsend Brown. And so in 1947, they were founded by Mary Von King, Leo McCormick, and L.G. Shreve. And we can see here that they soon were on a mission to China, of all places. And L.G. Shreve was traveling and involved, and Mary Von King, the executive vice president, was handling public relations and explaining their work, which another article shows us involved work in Europe as well, and teaching locals how to do agricultural development, economic development, and that was kind of their gig. Now, who was the Economic Cooperation Administration that was contracting Counsel Services becomes relevant. In this 1949 letter, authored by then Director of Central Intelligence, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, to the administrator of the ECA, the Economic Cooperation Administration, he explains that the CIA has a continuing need for economic intelligence info. He explains and qualifies that he's been receiving it in the past from the ECA. And he explains to the administrator he would like to up the classification of information they're getting from secret to top secret. And he thanks him for their continuing work. So by any definition, we can see here that the ECA was a covert arm of the CIA and doing work, supplying the CIA with economic intelligence. The ECA would eventually become absorbed into another group that then became by group, I mean a government agency that became USAID, the United States Aid for International Development, which is recognized by historians and researchers as doing good work and also being an opportunity for intelligence gathering and acting on behalf of the CIA and intelligence agencies. So here we have Council Services was formed. They're contracted by the ECA. Hillenkoetter, who went on to be an initial or the second, I guess, chairman of the board or president of NICAP, was certainly aware that the ECA ECA was collecting intelligence for the CIA. And here we see at this same time frame, 1949, this was in records obtained from the FBI, a request done on Mr. Leo McCormick, shows us that in his personnel file, we can see that he went to work for the ECA as a project manager. And reading through that file, we can see that he was very much involved in designing and implementing the plans that we talked about that were relative to the Marshall Plan and distributing aid internationally. And this certainly seems to go hand in hand with his former firm, Council Services work, and the CIA. This obviously was just a few months after Hillenkoetter sought to up the level of intelligence being collected from the ECA. Now here we have from Gordon Gray's FBI file. I point this out just as kind of a marker. There are many such articles of this nature, and his FBI file is dozens, hundreds of pages that we recently published. Provided it to our Patreons first and then eventually published it. That's what we do at Patreon, is post many of these records we receive. We initially post them there, let people look them over with us, help us analyze them, and then at the blog, we eventually post them with what we think some of the salient parts of it are. Gordon Gray was a big mid-20th century intelligence player. He was a national security consultant for multiple presidents. He went on to be the president of the University of North Carolina. He was an attorney. He worked on the clandestine collection committee. He worked on an economic committee out of New York, where he got his first gig with a law firm. This economic committee in New York was funded by government agencies. And how I first got on Mr. Gray's trail was he was the director of the first CIA Psychological Strategy Board during the early 1950s. And this was during the transition from Roscoe Hillenkoetter's CIA administration to General Walter Smith. When Smith became the director, he assembled a psychological strategy board, appointed Gray to run it. So it's certainly reasonable to think, with Gray's positions, that he was aware of what was going on with these different groups and organizations. He wrote an economic plan, a report for a president. that is called the Gray Report, and made recommendations about what he thought should be done internationally with aid. And we go into this more in the blog post. It gets complex, as you should suspect these stories to get. That if UFOs and paranormal topics play into these stories, then we should expect it to be complex, is why simple cursory looks at it don't provide a lot of information. And this is also from Gordon Gray's FBI file. The FBI conducted several security checks on him over the course of his career. The file we got covers about 25 years and multiple investigations to assure he was a low security risk and that he remained one due to the sensitive positions he held. And one of the men that were interviewed by the Bureau about Gordon Gray in 1948 was a Robert Haynes, who was the president of Wachovia Bank. This is relevant because Haynes later became the ECA administrator for Germany. So that's further evidence that the ECA was of interest to Hillenkoetter and to Smith and the Psychological Strategy Board, I think, can be reasonably suspected from this. It's also relevant because Gordon Gray's grandfather was a founder of Wachovia Bank. So as Erica and I discussed with Dr. Jeb Card on a show a while back, where we were discussing archaeologists and funding and sending archaeologists around the world to do the bidding of intelligence agencies, it kind of plays in here too that CIA and intelligence agencies are seeking cultured, wealthy, intelligent people. Gordon Gray was extremely intelligent, at least according to the people that measured his IQ in the Army, and he was apparently valued by those that worked with him. And here is evidence of his work with that Committee for Economic Development in New York that I discussed earlier.
And Jack, can you zoom in on that?
Yeah, sure. Is that better?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Sure. He was, at that point, the president of the University of North Carolina, and he was a consultant and member of the board for the Economic Development Committee. And a woman interviewed by the Bureau told them that the Economic Development Committee had funded work there at UNC that she just described as because they carry out its program, whatever we might interpret that to mean, in the tumultuous CIA of the 1950s. And as Erica aptly pointed out in her video, the CIA itself acknowledges that and documents its interest during this era of history in using UFOs as a potential psychological warfare tool. This is approximately a 1952 memo from then director Walter Smith to the director of the Psychological Strategy Board, which would have been Gordon Gray, and is pointing out his interest in developing or at least exploring the implications for psychological warfare of UFOs. And we're kind of getting into the time frame here of the Robertson panel, where they reported to the CIA that their concerns about UFOs included the potential for psychological warfare by enemies and adversaries to cause panic and various things. And the last slide in this group is about, so what kind of warfare, you might ask? Well, General Walter Bedell Smith and his colleagues at that time in the CIA, a man named Frank Wisner, who operated the Office of Policy Coordination, they were decorated for their involvement in a 1954 CIA-funded coup in Guatemala. And that continues to this day to be a jewel in the CIA's crown. They are proud of this activity and see it as an accomplishment and an achievement they should be proud of. This is debated and argued, among different people for what should be rather obvious reasons. But point being, for the sake of this discussion, General Smith is acknowledged by the CIA, decorated for his involvement in the Guatemala effort. The State Department documents it as well, and Frank Wisner's involvement. And this is a transcript from a memo of the operation, which was called PB Success, and it is preserved by the State Department. This transcript is, and this is a cable sent, a message sent from CIA in Florida to its station in Guatemala at that time. And it is addressing that the locals were upset about CIA involvement in their government and political affairs. And as a means to potentially distract attention from that story and the CIA's involvement, they suggest consideration to, quote, fabricate big human interest story like flying saucers, end quote. And so this has been of interest to UFO investigators for some time. But what I think I have done a bit more with here, and that we at EFR have, is go a little more into who was involved in that Guatemala case and how it plays into Hillenkoetter's CIA and then General Smith's CIA, and the recommendations that were coming from CIA consultants that were recommending to use the UFO topic as a psychological warfare tool. And as we continue, we'll look more at how this involved counsel services and other people they knew. But this is kind of a refresher of some things in our blog post.
Right. I mean, and you've worked so hard. Tell everybody how long it's been since you started doing this, researching this.
This particular aspect of it, I guess, has been, what's it been? 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. Erica helped me with some of this long before we incorporated EFR. She had some contacts that were familiar with NICAP and that were very helpful and instrumental in getting me some NICAP archive material that was key in helping me form some of the foundation and some of the ideas about my research. And it does take years. My thinking on these FOIA requests was I've been interested in UFOs all my life, ever since a kid. You know, I read the ghost story books at the school book fairs and all that, and was interested in woo and paranormal things. And I came in and out of it, but had largely been interested in it the last 15 to 20 years. And so my thinking with the FOIA process got that if we're just discussing the same thing over and over and over all the time anyway, what does it hurt to be waiting a year, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years for a FOIA request? Shouldn't you might as well be waiting on those things as not, so that
Right.
was kind of my
Absolutely.
thing.
And I just want to
Yeah.
give a shout out to Barry Greenwood, who is also with Expanding Frontiers and who has donated not only to me personally in the archive, my physical copies of things, but also to the online archive. And you can go to expandingfrontiersresearch.org to check out our online archive. And also Jan Aldrich, who has been on my show before you. Jan was a member of NICAP, and also Gordon Lohr, who has been on my show. He has since passed, and he was involved with NICAP back in the 60s. And so it was kind of this group for me, like this group of people that I had around me that helped me in a lot of ways to learn, and then coordinating with you, and then taking that story and expanding on it. And it's been interesting because you and I have a similar bent when it comes to things. And we've often asked the question as to, why don't people that are archiving or looking at the history of the subject, why aren't they looking at some of these other connections? And granted, there are a million different areas of research that you could hone in on. This is a vast topic in multiple, ways, but that for me is something that has been really missing in the subject. Since its inception, people aren't willing, it's either a UFO or it's debunked. And no one looks at the significance to people's involvement in the subject, the way information is moved, the way it influences people and countries, and to see, the fact that nobody's really, except for you, talking about NICAP and the intelligence connection. It's always dismissed. And that to me is mind blowing.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. That I can understand being interested in flying saucers, and I can understand just drawing a line somewhere, that I'm not going too far out in the weeds, that, now I've got 3 books on the Marshall Plan, and I'm reading about, 1940s economic legislation that started with, trying to run down a UFO case. So I can understand trying to keep a focus. Yet for me, there did come a tipping point where I don't want to talk in absolutes and say none of the time or any or all, but it felt like there aren't any UFOs in these UFO stories. There are people in these UFO stories, and there are people doing things and talking about things and pointing at things. And it seemed to me like an astute investigator would look at those people instead of the shadows that they're always talking about and pointing at. Yes.
And, I will say again, there are specific, an historian or an archivist have specific goals, and they're not doing research per se, but they're just gathering information and putting it in a means for that information to be preserved, and then disseminated. And so I guess there is that. But I just, I even in the UFO community in general, Jack, you and I have, I mean, a lot of conversations about this, but it's always black and white. And that really is, it's ridiculous. This is a gray subject in so many ways. And I think people, especially right now with the influence campaigns, whether it's people here in the country doing things for their own gain, whether it's, people abroad, whatever this is, or the intelligence communities, people need to understand that there is a nuance to this, and people need to understand and kind of step back from looking at it as, we're going to disprove this sighting or we're not, because there are so many factors at play. And we need to be, I think, more than probably ever, especially in the online community, really quick on our game to start kind of spot things. And just to dive off on this, Jack, because I think this is important. But, you look at UFO Twitter, which I don't get on, I just kind of observe, but you look at the way that, that group, that hashtag started, out of nowhere. And then you've got all these people that are going in there and inputting information. You've got people that are in there bullying people. You've got these, obviously it's not productive, but then you have, in my opinion, pretty significant influence campaigns that are taking place. And, what would you say to people who really enjoy the topic? What is your advice when somebody that's new to the subject gets in there and decides that they want to dig into it?
That's a really good question. I would recommend they be really careful about people that want to influence their opinion, that want to gain their trust a lot. This is a very partisan area that people will want to pull you into one way of thinking or another. It's a lot like religion, a lot. That they seem to feel like they get a feather in their cap if they get someone in their camp at the regional saucer club meeting, whatever it may be in any given area, or at the convention, or in the online group. And we're going to look at some things here that were kind of UFO Twitter of its day, with newsletters and things like that. And, the story, the narrative gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and people start to take something for granted as accurate. I did that for several years, because we don't know what we don't know. If you never pick up a book on mid-1940s finances, if you never read anything about psychology, if you never read anything about identified flying objects, about optical illusions, well, then there is a certain ignorance through a lack of familiarity. Excuse me. And that's just something to be concerned about, that I took it for granted certain things were true because my circle said them all the time and said them a lot. And then when I got increasingly involved in more proven research practices, I found that not only is it not true just necessarily, just because everybody says so, sometimes it's likely not, if it's just the popular perception. And you still have to run down, where's the documents that said this? And I feel like part of our story about NICAP, there was a researcher that called themselves Emma Best that did a lot of FOIA work and public records work, not in UFOs, but in politics, human rights, things like that. And they used to say something to the effect of, you can change 50 years of history in 15 minutes with the right FOIA request. I appreciate the sentiment, but it takes a lot to slow that elephant down and get it to turn around and start heading the other way. And I think we see that a lot with NICAP. I think a lot of people already made up their mind what it was about and what it wasn't, and they don't integrate new information into their assessment. And one of the biggest things about that I saw as I was researching it was, there's a general assumption the CIA infiltrated NICAP. Like, people generally don't have a problem with that part of it. In fact, I think they even like it to some extent. The "we got too close to the truth, they shut us down" thing. But my research suggested it's much more likely the CIA actually started it, and it may have been infiltrated by people that didn't know it was a CIA operation, or have been invited or put in place by CIA operatives. And it just there were just things, and we talked about separating opinion from things we can show to be fact. We can show to be fact that the CIA was adjacent to groups that incorporated and launched NICAP. We can show that intelligence officers and CIA directors and officers were on its board the duration of its existence, all the way to closing it down at the end. That certainly doesn't, in my experience, look like something that does not implicate the CIA. And
can I just stop you? Sorry,
yeah.
mid thought. So actually, go ahead, finish your thought, because I want to ask you.
Well, I just want to add that with CIA officers running the board of directors, the existence of the organization, it's reasonable to presume they were not overly disturbed with what was taking place, or it would have shut down at a different point in time.
And so I want to just make a statement here. The difference between some of what we're seeing today and NICAP, as we stated at the beginning of the show, is you can verify. You always have been able to verify their backgrounds. They are who they say they are. There is a paper trail. It is well documented. Whereas today you've got, as we were just saying, you've got people that are saying that they're involved with the intelligence community, and they're certainly not. So that is interesting. And I wanted to ask you too.
Yeah, that any further than Tom DeLonge says so, you can't verify their credentials. You're
right.
correct.
Yeah, very shadowy people that are definitely working behind the scenes, or in, Parler or Telegram or some of these channels, and swaying information. But do you, with well, anyway, go ahead, because I wrote something down and then I forgot my train of thought. You go right ahead.
Jump in anytime that it occurs.
I will. It's never a problem.
Let's go ahead and move along to some other slides, if I'm not putting everyone to sleep with them. Let's look some more here at council services and exactly how they played into this. Or I will try to. Let's see if I can get this to work.
Okay, and I'll take the minute while you're trying to figure that out and say, make sure you like, click, subscribe, share this information. We need to build this channel up. As you know, I was on my old YouTube channel and I had quite a few subs, but now we need to do that with Expanding Frontiers. So get the word out and make sure you're clicking and liking and subscribing on the show, and join our channel. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. We would very much appreciate your help promoting the blog, the show, the Patreon. All of that would be very much appreciated. So there we go. Okay. Now what we're looking at here, you'll recall Mary Von King was a founder and worked with Council Services that was contracted by the ECA, the Economic Cooperation Administration, which collected intelligence for the CIA. Well, here we see that she helped incorporate NICAP. This is from a NICAP archive. It shows that on August 1956, they applied for incorporation, which was approved in October of that year. And present were T. Townsend Brown, the first front man of the organization, Mary Von King, and a man named Thomas D. O'Keefe. Now, this is a contract from the same point in time. They simultaneously entered into a contract proposed by Council Services. She uses the firm name here, signs it as the president. And among the things that were stipulated in this contract were that Council Services had the right to retain as necessary regional directors and consultants, and they would work under the supervision of the senior officers of the firm, namely Mr. O'Keefe and Mary Von King. So when I started discovering this, I thought, now this is getting kind of interesting. So in 1956, we have an organization, a PR firm that we know was acting abroad with the ECA is now incorporating NICAP. So what else could I learn about these people? Well, Mr. O'Keefe's resume that he apparently gave to NICAP, or to Council Services that gave to NICAP when they proposed this contract, he listed as former employers the Secretary of Defense, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and he also was involved as a consultant on trade and finance, and was a member of the selection board for foreign service officers of the U.S. State Department, which I thought was really interesting. That basically that is saying that Mr. O'Keefe helped assign spies for foreign service and is named in the NICAP contract as someone that can select personnel that will work under his direction. And here was a handwritten note in that same NICAP archive file that someone noted that Mr. O'Keefe should condense this to one page and make it similar in form to, I interpret this to be TTB history. So I think that's T. Townsend Brown history. I think this indicates that Mr. O'Keefe from the State Department was writing promotional material for NICAP during its organizing in early days. And here we see someone else that seems to have ridden in with Council Services and Mary Von King and Mr. O'Keefe that we're going to talk some about. A man named Nicholas de Rochefort. We can see that he was listed, and this is from NICAP promotional material that they list their officers, and he is Executive Vice Chairman of the board, Nicholas de Rochefort. And this is an example of his name on letters that were going out, inquiring about advertising with the Christian Herald and potentially running NICAP ads and things like that in them. This is from 2 to 3 dozen pages of records I obtained from the FBI on Nicholas de Rochefort. It was fascinating to me that year, in the summer of 1956, the State Department requested security check on Nicholas de Rochefort and wanted him cleared for work. We can see that by November of 1956, the month after NICAP was approved for incorporation, Special Agent McCrae completed a report that he sent to the director from the Washington field office, and it tells the kind of work that that de Rochefort was doing. He was with the Department of Commerce. He was a trade fair manager in the Office of International Trade Affairs. He had sought and was obtaining United States citizen status. He was actually a Russian-born Frenchman. He had worked as an interpreter in 1956. He had worked in an advertising council, and he had worked on a project to counter communist propaganda that was verified by the FBI. So it certainly seemed that he was being positioned to do similar work, one could reasonably determine. And I obtained a lot of material about what was called Count de Rochefort, and he was acknowledged and recognized as an expert in psychological warfare. He did speeches on Radio America and different pro-democracy radio shows, television appearances, things like that. And a very interesting part of that FBI file here, in that report in November of 1956 that had been compiled during October and November, the special agent in charge at Washington informed the director of the FBI that information was obtained from a redacted informant with the stipulation that it was furnished in strict confidence, and the fact it was furnished by that informant and who he was should not be disseminated outside of your office, and it is redacted. And I have spent several years now trying to get that further declassified as well, and hope to have some success with it. I've kind of had a turning point with that. Now here I'm going to introduce another character, Desmond FitzGerald. He, like Gordon Gray, was a New York attorney, worked in a New York law firm, and he received funding from a man named Clendenin Ryan, and who was interested in democracy and CIA values, and would fund a political action committee that Desmond FitzGerald started, that you can see here, was called the Committee of 5 Million. And that was a political action committee in New York that was about a mayoral election. And one of the things I discovered while going through this and going through these records was that Nicholas de Rochefort in the early 1950s started a political action committee called the Committee of 1 Million. So, isn't that a coincidence? And de Rochefort's committee was about the China lobby. And let me turn this off and see if I can join you on screen, Erica.
Fascinating. Oh, hello. Just kidding. Well, okay. So here we go. All right. Jack is back.
Thank you.
10-second delay. Great slide
Yeah,
presentation.
so Nicholas de Rochefort, and I know it's kind of hard to keep all this in context, that rode into town with council services, was credited in newspaper articles and by journalists and major publications as being the brains and the founder behind the Committee of 1 Million, that just so happened to be a very similar name to a PAC that a deputy director of the CIA had once formed in another state a few years earlier. And this Committee of 1 Million became the wealthiest, most influential group in the China lobby in Washington, D.C. It opposed Red China's admission to the United Nations. And we are to believe the man that was working on this sashayed into NICAP and wanted to help research UFOs.
Right. And, that gives me, I want to just ask you, at what point are people, like I mention all the time, at what point are people actually working on behalf of a foreign adversary? And those people that are working with NICAP, at what point in time do you question their agendas? And I know you're you need documentation, which is absolutely the truth. But do you think
I think that's the point here. I think
right.
You're right. If you don't know what somebody's doing and why they're doing it, there's, a saying about if you're the only one at the card table that doesn't know who the mark is. And I think that applies. So I think your line of reasoning is on point there, that I don't claim to know what these people were doing. I'm open to getting more information, learning more about it, but I feel extremely confident, Erica, it was not recreationally investigating UFOs. And so that should be a red flag. Yes, indeed it should, about getting involved and putting one's allegiance and putting one's money behind groups and political committees. Very much I am talking about the parallels to today. Yes. That is based on emotionalism and getting you involved from some emotional aspect. It could be as simple as grifting. It could be adversaries. It could be, with propaganda to influence elections and undermine American democracy. It could be American intelligence agents working with completely goodwill and intention as well. I tend to think that my gut shot, I think Nicholas de Rochefort and the people that started NICAP had varying agendas, and the ones that were using it for propaganda, I tend to think were patriotic and thought they were doing things for the right reasons. And that I think Thomas O'Keefe may have suspected, and the CIA and the State Department, Office of Policy Coordination, its lineage of officers, thought that they would be able to get offices in foreign countries under the guise of investigating UFOs and things like that, that they could send out reports that your country is being devastated by UFOs. And obviously, people believe that stuff without needing to see any of it with their own eyes. So I think a lot was going on there. I'm kind of cutting to the end here, but that's okay. When I say, as you and my research has shown, there's an unnerving element of fascism in all of this too. So, and I say that because just because some men from the State Department and the CIA may have believed they were doing the right things doesn't mean they were right. Just because Roscoe Hillenkoetter thought signing off on Project Bluebird was giving people in his command more authority to interrogate more effectively doesn't mean he was right. And let's not forget that that's who we're talking. Those are the men we're talking about here. The architects of Bluebird, Artichoke, MK Ultra are who we're talking about here.
I just want to say, hey, Vancouver guy, thanks for joining us, and always good to know that you're busy doing research. We know you are, so welcome to the show. Yeah, thanks for talking about that, Jack. I think, like I said, this is, as we always stress, this is such a diverse topic, and there's so many layers to it. And we've done shows in the past month, 2 months, where I've interviewed cult experts to find out how people are indoctrinated into cults. And oftentimes the lower layers can run, if you get people that are recruiting, that lens for Blair kind of obfuscation. So I mean, it is interesting to see the way these things can work, and the parallels, or the story that you're putting forward about NICAP, its inception, and the players that were involved, and potential motivations. I mean, that really is just fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I remember something that stood out. I remember when you and Vanessa Valilko did a show together, and you were discussing some of this, and you were discussing, if I recall correctly, Major Kehoe's racism and some of his extremist ideas. And I recall Vanessa saying something to the effect of, they've got to at least put an asterisk with this guy's stuff, that like, and I can appreciate the sentiment. I won't try to paraphrase either of you or Vanessa any further. I'll just say myself that if a person has extremist ideas, and if they're they have agendas about politics, and by any stretch of the imagination and the definition, what Kehoe was a public relations man. He had run Lindbergh's tour. He didn't do research. He got on shows, and he was good at it. he got on shows. He did political lobbying. He made splashes in the pool to where he got himself a topic in Washington. He took aim at and attacked the United States Air Force and the Central Intelligence Agency, and he did it pretty effectively. He tried with the FBI, but Hoover had various techniques that were pretty effective in dealing with him. But yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a disconnect there between these guys started and ran this organization, and Richard Hall published a book with 800 cases that we're going to talk about UFOs in this book. There's a lot of disconnect there for this researcher. I'll just put it that way.
And so what was happening, with the worldwide political landscape, the race to space, weapons developments, in this time frame, that would be potentially another reason for people to offer UFOs as a cover story or a distraction?
It's interesting you say that, because that very note, the handwritten note that we don't know who wrote it, that I shared, that somebody had just scribbled, let's get O'Keefe to do a piece on this, and yada yada, about like he did on Brown's history. That was adjacent to a letter in the NICAP file that was about space law, and that Townsend Brown was writing an attorney about an article he read that the attorney had published on space law. So yeah, clearly that was something that Brown and his circles were saying, we need to do more with this. So yeah, I mean, a lot was going on, and there were people on the NICAP periphery and its orbit that were interested in forming clubs where they'd wear pins on their lapels, and all of these different marketing ideas to boost this topic. And it seems, again, like I already said, I really don't see any other way to look at it than if it wasn't instigated by intelligence agencies. They certainly didn't see any reason to put a stop to it, and sat right there on its board of directors watching it go on for some 13 years before they decided they'd heard enough out of Kehoe.
Interesting. And so how many of the people that originally started NICAP, how many of them were active duty or were still involved, and how many of them had retired? Just off the top of your head.
I don't know exactly. It was primarily retired people that got brought to the board. And one of the things they were really good at, and by they, I don't mean just Kehoe. Brown was good at this. There's another questionable character. I think his name was DeHalo. I don't have it in front of me, but it seemed like a Hispanic or a South American name. And I suspected that he was a CIA asset for various reasons that are outlined in Wayward Sons. A lot of them were very talented at compiling advisory committees and lists of names of very influential intelligence people, and general this, colonel that, just up and down the list. Many of them had intelligence ties, if not careers. James Carrion pointed out to us how General Wiedemeyer was not only listed as a NICAP advisor, but what Carrion pointed out to us was that, very interestingly, there was a note in one of the NICAP journals saying that Wiedemeyer had retired because his name was never supposed to be published and he didn't want to be publicly associated, which is extremely interesting. That just, sends a lot of mixed messages about who's running this and who's editing this, and do they know that like this guy like is supposed to be behind the scenes? Like, what are they doing here? And we're back to the point you aptly made about, if you don't know who's scamming who or even what the scam is, you're in no position to be explaining it to other people.
Right. But I mean, and it's just so fascinating because there are, you're peeling back the layers, and it's the more that we find out, the more fascinated I am. I think there are plenty of days when, I just, it's like this, you look at the online community, you look at the, what's going on with all of the smoke screen stuff that is taking place, the hands of groups, whatever, foreign adversaries, whatever. But I think I love looking at and identifying, what the potential is behind the scenes. That to me it's so powerful and fascinating. And it really, this subject has been a great education for me on a lot of levels. A lot.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Shall I continue with some more slides?
Yes. And I want to just say, Jason, really quickly, Jason, thank you so much for your kind comment. I appreciate that. And I need to get Vancouver guy back on the show. So we'll do that.
What I'm going to pull up here is about a gentleman named Julius Amos, and he went by the nickname Pete. And this is just a representation of his work. This is from a CIA file on him. November 1953, the Washington Post did a multi-page layout on Colonel Amos, who was a CIA officer, career officer. He was assigned internationally, a veteran, Top Gun, heavy player, experienced, rugged guy by any stretch of the imagination. One of the things he was most known for in the agency was that he wrote a paper on something he called leaderless resistance. And as the story went, this did not go over well among his upline officers and colleagues. Colonel Amos at least expressed that he was of the position that all this cloak and dagger stuff got people killed. And you shouldn't be going into Guatemala or Iran using safe houses and a chain of command to blow things up and overturn the government, but you should be winning hearts and minds through propaganda. And he had a much more palatable message about, if democracy is prevailing and true, then let's just tell people about it. What do we need all of this other stuff for? And as you can imagine, the CIA wasn't real sure about let's all just hold hands in a circle as compared to a chain of command. And the role he took in his latter years of service was as a rebel and a rogue. I'm not sure if that was sincere or his position as he was told to take. I'm sure, again, historians and people that worked on this as their area of expertise could tell me much more about him. But his public expressed position was that he was calling out the CIA, said it's high time for a change, and he married a fellow spy by the name of Veronica Grogan, who was also making her living in the clandestine services. She went by the name Ron Grogan a lot of the time. And they started a group that gets really interesting to me. It was the International Service of Information Foundation. And I got on their trail because I read an allegation that they were a client of Council Services, and I found that to likely be true. And there's some really interesting correlations here. 1953, we're in the time frame of the Psychological Strategy Board, General Smith transitioning to DCI Allen Dulles, and a really intriguing aspect of this to me was what Amos and Grogan's shtick was that they did this mailing list that had claimed to have some 1,000 clients, and they would give intelligence reports and information. And like, this is what I was talking about earlier, Erica, when I said kind of UFO Twitter of its day. They were supposedly giving the inside scoop because Amos supposedly had all his contacts, whether he was working with the CIA anymore or not. And he was bringing it to the people, letting them know what was going on. And this mirrored what NICAP became a couple short years later to me in a really intriguing way. 1,000-person mailing list. They claim to be bringing in about 25 grand a year from this venture, which was good money in those days. And they're just admitted spies that are like, yeah, what about it? But we're telling you the truth about what's going on. And the reason I identified it as accurate, one of the reasons that Amos and Grogan's foundation was a client of Council Services was, here is one of Amos's newsletters on file at the CIA, released in 2003. And we can see that his address is 219 West Monument Street in Baltimore. And let's circle back to Council Services announcing their opening. And we see it's 219 West Monument Street in a neighborhood of Baltimore. So Ms. Von King and company were probably among the first firms that ever provided office addresses for at-home businesses, and in this circumstance, a couple of CIA officers. And then I found a library at the University of Oregon that had boxes donated on Amos, different boxes. And I found that a folder in one of these boxes was titled King. So I requested that folder, and a helpful employee at the university library helped me get copies of it. And this particular letter we can see was to Dear Mary. Someone had added this. That's not my writing. It was on the copy when I got it, King. And this was not written by Mr. Amos, at least not signed by him, even though it's on his stationery. It was written by Veronica Grogan. And she is telling Mary about their journey through Europe and at this time. She is writing her, and she opens the letter by saying, I thought I'd write you a line that has nothing to do with the foundation and newsletter, which further clarified to me that they're a customer. That's why I even start it that way if you're not collaborating together. And this letter goes on to say nothing that I identified as particularly relevant. I don't honestly know why it was written, or what it may have been indirectly communicating to someone. I did think later, though, about that it's interesting to me that it was preserved and saved, because I have some questions about how that would even happen. That, like, if Amos sent a letter, why would he have a copy of it? Unless he and Veronica copied it themselves for preservation. But the fact that it's marked received here kind of implies that it was collected from Mary Von King and or Council Services. So I have some questions about how it was preserved and why. Like, why would it even be important? Like, we're not seeing, just a postcard to a cousin preserved in there or something. So I find that kind of interesting. That, by the way, is one of the things that I always wonder about as I've gotten more experienced with reading FBI files is when I see a letter in an FBI file that's not to the FBI, I always kind of wonder how they got it. Did they just intercept it and copy it, or what happened? And by the way, Amos was a very colorful character, along with painting himself as a CIA rebel. He invented Grecian hair formula for men. He was an interesting guy. His letters that are preserved were as likely to be suggesting a stock buy to someone as they were passing along supposedly secret intelligence. And now we get into just what sent it over the edge for me. In 1952, when Grogan and Amos returned to the States, they decided what they needed to do was alert the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson about a UFO report that Amos knew next to nothing about. Told them in his report he submitted that he didn't see it, that he was told about it by someone that was told about it. And that someone, he said, was a man named Lou Corbin, who worked at a radio station in Baltimore. Then the OSI officer assigned to this case that became a part of Blue Book proceeded to start interviewing Corbin and the witnesses. And he discovered, among other things, that in Amos's initial report, he claimed that Corbin was a member of the Army Counterintelligence Corps, or CIC, which was an elite group of counterintelligence officers. Corbin would later deny that, and he denied that he told Amos that, but he acknowledged he was an intelligence officer in World War II. The long and short of the UFO story is that Corbin knew two young men that said they saw a flying saucer. The OSI investigator ran it down, and upon repeated questioning, managed to get one of the young men to say he never really saw it, but that the other one claimed he saw it and wanted his friend to lie in order to make his story more believable. And the OSI investigator kind of lost interest at that point, and I think determined it was not worth pursuing further. But for whatever reasons, what interested me about this, for whatever reasons, we can see here that Corbin denies to the OSI officer that he was an intelligence officer. And another interesting aspect of the story, very interesting, was that Amos, when he reported it initially to the Air Force, listed two witnesses that were supposedly a father and son, George and John Mason here. And they could never be found or proven to exist. And Corbin denied that he gave Amos those names, says he doesn't recall anything about them. So we have here a circumstance where counsel services represented CIA officers who were distributing a newsletter to what they claimed to be a fairly large audience, and decided they needed to get in the UFO business. A CIA officer took up a hearsay UFO report that he gave to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for reasons we can only imagine why he felt like he needed to get involved in that, and was represented by the group that then helped Townsend Brown incorporate NICAP and wanted to be able to assign regional directors and consultants that worked for them. So I hope I made it clear how interesting I found that, and how peculiar it seemed to me, if we're trying to think that this was all just about recreational fun and UFO investigation.
No, I mean, you lay this out perfectly, and it's absolutely fascinating. I just want to mention that Jeff has been adding comments in chat, about some of the research that he's doing, and I just I would love to get both he and Rachel back on the show to talk about some of his work in connection with what you're doing, because some of the names obviously are the same, and it's always good to put your heads together on this. But I've got to ask you, what have been, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, you've always had, we came into this, we had different ideas. As we've educated ourselves, those ideas have changed and become more based in actual evidence, and not hearsay or believing what other people are promoting without validation of that. But what have been some of the biggest things, some of the biggest discoveries that you've made while you've been involved in this topic that have really kind of taken you aback?
The first thing that comes to mind, and I hope you'll take it as a compliment, Martin Cannon's work. Martin Cannon's work to me was like looking at one of those 3D pictures that you've got to look at a certain way and then you see it. It was kind of like that, wow, there's different ways to look at this than aliens are just dragging people out of their houses willy-nilly. And that can sound silly, but I mean, if you've got a lot of MUFON under your belt and a lot of Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs books between your ears, you can forget how to look at something as there may be other explanations to some of this, any of it. So that was big. Mark Pilkington is just fantastic. We've had the pleasure of speaking with him, like we've had the pleasure of speaking with Martin Cannon. It's important to open neural pathways and to teach old dogs new tricks, to reroute the drainage from one ditch into another, and find other ways to look at things. I noticed our recent blog post and video. I saw some social media sites around the internet discussing it, and the black and white thinking really prevails. Probably no more in this genre than any other aspect of American culture, but there's a lot of black and white thinking, that there were people offended that we're saying UFOs are bunk. There were people saying these guys are right, UFOs are bunk, and everything in between. And I don't recall saying UFOs are bunk anywhere in the article or in the video. And that's the point. I'm looking at a specific CIA officer in the last 10 minutes. His name was Amos. Here's what he did. Wow. Here's who he worked with. Wow. Look who they worked with. That matters. And now if you're going to throw it, like if your rebuttal to that is, yeah, but what about the 1762 air balloon case before there was a CIA? Like, that's just a non sequitur response.
Interesting. So what else? And that's a great answer. And it has been interesting to see the threads on social media about our different chat groups about our articles, and assuming that that we are are we skeptical? Are we debunkers? We're not debunkers. We want factual information. And I think that we're not. If there is information that is important, we're going to put that forward wherever that leads us. And it has both led us into a path I never would have expected that my journey through this would be, so different from when I initially got involved and excited about the topic. But it has. And I think that people need to be open to change. I dare to dream, to be open to thinking about new ideas and looking at things from maybe not such a granular level, but maybe looking above the topic and starting to dissect all of these intersections and communities and operations and intentions of people. And I think that's really important. And it's not only, and it's exciting to me. I mean, it's, so I would have loved, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I mean, I do believe that there are possibilities. I'm not a black and white person. You're not a black and white person. And I believe and I know that what we know now is not what we're going to know in 10 years, and so on and so on. And there will always be things that elude us, that we can't explain. And that's kind of the fun of it. So I just want to say this because I was thinking about this. I don't want to discount people's experiences, because I know that people have had very important and life-changing experiences with things that they cannot explain. And that's wonderful. I also want to offer a word of caution. And just the other day, and sorry to go off on this tangent, Jack, but the other day I was looking at a person on UFO Twitter, and I was very sad to see the fact that this person was very clearly having a mental break. And seeing some of the people I think that were trying to be very supportive and not knowing what to do, and then people that were kind of jumping in that this is it must be UFOs. It's got to be aliens, and so I think that we have to do our due diligence as human beings that care about each other to make sure that we are learning and putting forward, disseminating factual information for the sake of others who could potentially be manipulated or potentially fall into a belief system that is very negative. And I think these are things that I am very, as you know, I'm very passionate about. And I have experienced these things firsthand and seen the damage that they can do to a person's life. And if you don't have your bearings about you, it is a very slippery slope. And other people in the community have a responsibility to understand that as well and put forward good information. So
Well put, well put. And if you're okay with it, I'm going to take us through one more set of slides here.
absolutely. And hey, Drew, nice to see you.
I'm going to kind of presume that people know who Dr. Menzel is. Donald Menzel. He was a Princeton educated Harvard astronomer, and he had a exchange of letters in the 1960s with former DCI and former chairman of the NICAP board, Admiral Hillenkoetter. And this one kind of starts us off in 1961. I obtained these, by the way, from the American Philosophical Society library. They helped me and provided the folder. And all of this stuff is either linked in the YouTube description or at our blog post, which is linked in the description. And here, Menzel in these letters expresses his concern about NICAP's attack on intelligence agencies. Menzel had a clearance. He was under FBI surveillance pretty much all his life for one thing or another, and cleared to work on projects with the Navy. Hillenkoetter, of course, is known for his public pro-UFO statements. And I found this kind of amusing, that one of the lines that Menzel says is, he talks about using Hillenkoetter to try to get Congress to investigate the Air Force. And he makes the remark here that Kehoe's misusing his authority, and it's clearly a personal feud on Kehoe's part with the Air Force and with the CIA. And I thought this was kind of amusing. In my opinion, the congressional investigation should be of Kehoe and NICAP, rather than UFOs. And I kind of find that amusing in today's context of, should they be investigating UFOs or what these guys are doing that keep trying to direct them to investigate UFOs? But what all of the hubbub came about was, and why I think Menzel saved these records and had them preserved, was in 1963, he gave Hillenkoetter a copy of his book that was skeptical on UFOs, to which Hillenkoetter, you can see here, responds and thanks him for the book, tells him, "To my mind, it was very well done and I enjoyed it. I should say you've effectively put to rest all surmises about flying saucers being from outer space. You've done a thorough and praiseworthy job." And he and Menzel talked some about Hillenkoetter was leaving NICAP, that he thought it had degenerated into something he didn't want to be a part of, or at least that's what he was indicating to Menzel. But then all of this kind of blew up when Menzel had said publicly that Hillenkoetter praised his work and endorsed it, which we can see here he did. And in a UFO Investigator, which was a NICAP publication, Kehoe quotes Hillenkoetter as denying Menzel's claim that he had read his book and found it praiseworthy. And then Kehoe goes as far as publishing a letter from Hillenkoetter where Hillenkoetter states that he's had very little interaction with Menzel and basically doesn't know what he's talking about. And so then, to finish it, in 1965, Dr. Menzel replies to Hillenkoetter and sends him the article along with a copy of the letter that justifies and substantiates Menzel's previous statements that Hillenkoetter had in fact substantiated his work and endorsed his work and agreed with it, and had said that he did not leave NICAP because he was pressured by the government or anything like that. And these stories that Kehoe was constantly spinning and that Hillenkoetter was publicly agreeing with, but then basically giving Menzel an alternative story privately. And Menzel got tired of it and called him on it. He did it diplomatically. He said, apparently you've forgotten this letter you sent and things like that. But I feel quite confident in my assessment. That's why Menzel preserved that exchange of letters, so that when someone like me came along 60 years later, it would be there to show, here is documentation that the CIA director was talking out of both sides of his mouth about UFOs and encouraging Kehoe to say this stuff and do these things while telling me he was leaving the organization because Kehoe was a loose cannon. Yeah.
It's just so fascinating.
I mean, yet another angle of that, one more angle of it. Mm-hmm. Those that are really into this stuff will know that in Bill Moore and them's work on the alleged Majestic 12, Hillenkoetter was, of course, supposed to be one of the Majestic 12 that were overseeing crash saucer retrievals, but also named in the Majestic 12 documents that are widely believed to be forgeries, or at least never substantiated to be authentic. Dr. Menzel was also named, and a lot of people thought that might be an inside joke because they knew what a skeptic he was, and to put him on there as being on the UFO crash retrieval team. But in this context, this certainly would indicate that these two men exchanging letters were not both aware that each other were on a top secret crash retrieval team that knew about the existence of UFOs, obviously. The only way you could go with that is if the letters were to throw us off the track that they knew this, which you've got to prove that somehow, not just dream it up.
Right. And can you just, even though, I would like you, for people that don't know, if they're tuning into the show, this is their first time, they're new to the UFO topic, just give us a little snippet of what is MJ12 and what effect has it had in this sphere?
My go-to source for that is Adam Go Rightly's Saucer Spooks and Kooks. It lays it out with citations of where the story originated, how it got legs. The short answer is some researchers claim to get some film of some documents in the mail. They developed the film. Lo and behold, we've got a whistleblower that's telling us about a top secret crash retrieval team. The documents were never substantiated to be real, and there was some real good research into the likelihood they were in fact frauds. The MJ-12 itself, the Majestic 12, was supposed to be a team of educated, knowledgeable, well-connected intelligence officials and scientists, including Hillenkoetter and Menzel, that would have been overseeing this, answered only to the president, if the president, I don't remember all of it exactly, but that was the gist of it.
And so tell us a little bit about what period of time was this popular? And we've obviously seen a resurgence of this. This is never going to go away because you've got more people coming in and then promoting MJ-12 and thinking things are real, that clearly people have done a lot of research on to understand that there are some major questions about this. But
oddly enough, the Roswell crash and then its subplots like MJ-12 didn't really take off until later in the 20th century, like late 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And then they kept, as this thing does, they kept needing another fold, another serial chapter, because things never get resolved and everybody just kind of starts going home bewildered. So to have another book, another documentary, another annual UFO symposium, you've got to have a new story. You can only rehash things people already know so many times. And one of the reasons, in my opinion, is that they don't do more forensic research like James Carrion, forensic historic research, is because it does not lead to sensational conclusions. It doesn't verify any of these anecdotal stories, and it brings up many very questionable circumstances that not only are we not looking at, but they seem to be trying to obstruct to a certain extent. And I know you've talked a lot about that, Erica, about if archivists are trying to disseminate the documents, why aren't they disseminating the documents? And why aren't they doing these type of FOIA requests and publishing this information? And the reason I got interested in it is there's meat on these bones. I can learn things about Colonel Amos. I can correspond with the FBI and find out what they have on Mary Von King and on Gordon Gray and the circles they kept. I can't do anything about a story that Bill Moore made up. There's nothing I can do about that.
Right. And it is, again, it's interesting to look at this from 100 feet above the looking at it from above, and then looking at the way, again, like information does get recycled, and you've got this a whole new group of people that are basically promoting the same narrative decade after decade after decade. And it's just, we got to get over that at some point in time. But clearly,
yeah, and they will come back and they'll bring up these same stories for a crowd that they're banking on. I presume they're banking on a majority of them don't know about the Dulce's story. They don't know about Snyder and that he was mentally ill, and that we've got the FBI documents that say so, and all of this stuff. They'll just go with, hey, here's an article where the guy says he was there in the shootout under the desert, and just over and over and over and over. Yeah.
That's one I haven't heard for a while, though, but I'm sure I just haven't combed the recesses of of the UFO land on the internet. But fascinating discussion, Jack, and you again. Just I commend you for all the work that you've done. It has been a learning experience for me to follow your work and the UFO trail that you put out there for all of us to look at. And I want to just say that it's a great pleasure to have you as a research partner and as somebody is just really the backbone of Expanding Frontiers research. So thank you for all that you do. And I want to thank everybody for listening and making sure that you click, like, and subscribe to the show. And yeah, Dodie, that's Jason just brought up Dodie. That's, oh Lord, that's another one. That's a good story for another day. But yeah, yeah. But I want to make sure too that you guys get on to expandingfrontiersresearch.org. You can join our email list. We have a Patreon page that is incredible, and we give out information before some of this stuff goes to the public, and so you get a firsthand look. And just donating $15 a month helps us so much because we are doing FOIA requests. We are spending our money. We're spending a lot of our own money to make sure that this organization got off the ground and is active and is actively pursuing things that we are disseminating to the public. We just recently, and Jack, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what you recently received yesterday, or should we just tease the public?
I seem to have froze again, didn't I? But
You did, but I can hear you.
Good. Yeah, we are getting some court documents or documents that reflect court proceedings about some circumstances that people have shown interest in that we're going to be working on. We are and reporting on. We're getting more information about some wildlife circumstances and poisoning in the Utah area, as Erica worked on with Dr. Munch. And we're going to be reporting more on that. We've got a number of things going on. We've got a lot of outstanding requests that periodically, couple, 3 times a month or more, we get records that sometimes there are fees with them, sometimes not. I would really encourage folks to go to expandingfrontiersresearch.org, where you can make a one-time payment through our secure link, or you can join our Patreon, and for as little as $15 a month, get the records many times as we receive them, that we're doing on different aspects of things of public interest, from criminal cases to UFOs to current events, just all kinds of things. And Erica, I really appreciate the compliments and kind things you said about me, and it's reciprocated. And I really appreciate working and doing research with you as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And yes, expandingfrontiersresearch.org. Thank you all for being here. It is really, to me, to have such a great crowd of people, a great group of people out there who are adding ideas and comments in the world of making sure, like Jeff tonight, hearing Jeff's comments, that was really great. And I appreciate all of you. And I know that Martin's listening. We've mentioned Martin numerous times in the show. And so thanks, Martin, for listening. And we'll have to have you back as well. So we do also have an upcoming show. We haven't scheduled it yet, but this is going to be really, really fun. We are going to be interviewing 2 people at the X-Files Preservation Collection. And so that will be fun. We all know the X-Files, because I know that was kind of in my day when I grew up, and that was such a, back in the 80s and 90s and things, when the X-Files first broke, and that was just such a sexy and an exciting TV show that really seated us with a lot of ideas about cattle mutilations, or helped promote those types of stories. And it was just so such a great series. So I'm really, really looking forward to interviewing them and talking about the Chris Carter collection, and just going over all the events that they're doing. So we've got lots of great shows coming up. I'm also going to be interviewing more environmental activists, because that is something that means a lot to me, especially here in Utah. We are still looking into Joe Firmage, and we are looking into other people and criminal cases, and those people who have intersected in this world of UFOs and conspiracy militia movement. So we've got a lot going on. So I want to just thank all of you, and you guys have a wonderful, safe weekend, and we will get the show scheduled and let you guys know. Again, please make sure you share so we can grow the channel, and we appreciate you. Have a wonderful evening.